Transcending the Ritual of Sorrow, a talk by Avatar Adidas Samraj, taken from his book Easy Death. The sorrow you feel when someone you know dies is, at least to some significant degree, a learned response. Perhaps it can even be totally accounted for as a learned response. In any case, such sorrow is a response you must, in due course, overcome. It seems to you to be a natural response, but it is in fact rather automatic, learned, and conventional. It is the response you feel you are obliged to make, whereas the only real response to which you are called has nothing to do with sorrow. You tend not to be equipped to demonstrate freedom from sorrow when somebody dies. Rather, you become involved with the vision of death in front of you, the leftovers, the grotesque meat form that is breaking up and returning to the elemental state. Under such circumstances, you forget the point of view of truth and basically indulge in the presumption that death is a problem. Death is a living event, and sorrow is a basic component of your reaction to somebody's dying. Sorrow is ego-based. It is your way of dwelling on what you have lost. The feeling of sorrow does not really take into account the one who has died, except as someone from whom you have become separated. Thus, most of the emotions you indulge when somebody dies are your own problems, reactions you must deal with or overcome. Nevertheless, it is not altogether inappropriate to be sorrowful when someone dies, but you must find another resource, a greater capability, through which to be free of the vision of death that confronts you at such a time. The sorrow you feel at someone's death is not just the result of memory. It is ritual, like so much of the rest of what everyone does repetitively, compulsively, constantly, hour after hour, day after day, from birth until death. People generate very few truly appropriate actions in the entire period between birth and death. Therefore, most of the sorrow associated with death is unnecessary, a self-destructive and other destructive ritual. Passing through the ritual sorrow and complication relative to the sickness or death of someone with whom you have had a very strong emotional connection and daily interaction is, perhaps, inevitable. You must still overcome your sorrow, but sorrow is, at least temporarily, appropriate. If you have a rather distant relationship to someone who dies, however, then hearing of his or her death is almost like reading the obituary column in the newspaper. Reactivity is basically a ritual you engage all day long, week after week, month after month, year after year, as you cycle through the ritualized demonstrations of mind, emotion, breath, and body. There is no ultimate necessity for it. Your emotional reactivity is an organized form of behavior for which you are not responsible, and your irresponsibility is the problem of life, the dreaded gombu. That was a humorous name that Adidar gave the ego, this activity of the self-contraction, which is not necessary. The gombu, this imaginary disease, is not merely a little bit of philosophy. It is a ritual life, a pre-rehearsed, prefigured automaticity you crank out every day of your life in relation to standard events. You are always doing it. You live as if you are diseased. The dreaded gombu is a real disease in the sense that you experience it and are animated in it every day of your life. But it is imaginary or unreal in the sense that it is not necessary, not based in reality. It is just an automaticity. It has no necessity. Since the dreaded gombu is unnecessary, there is therefore no necessity to devote your life to overcoming it. But people are so full of their rituals, so bound up by forces of habit and states of reactivity, that they are not free to enter the real spiritual process, because they must attend to all their egoic rituals and serve their egoic priesthood. It is almost as if they were paid employees of cosmic nature. Because people have all these obligations, they are therefore not free to practice freedom and truth. They are devotees of the cult of cosmic nature, death and egoity, just cranking out this life of reaction. Well, either there is truth or there is not. If there is no truth, then you might as well continue to do what you are doing. But if there is truth, then you must make room for it. You must give up your commitment to conditionally manifested nature and become involved in a totally different kind of existence. To do so is your business, and only you can do it. Only you can renounce the cult of your false suffering. Devotee, beloved Adidar, I remember when I received the telephone call from my brother notifying me that my father had died in London. He was fairly young, about 62, when he died of throat cancer. I had not had any relationship with him for 15 years, except for one meeting, because I was a member of a monastic community whose discipline included abandoning karmic connections. I remember being very surprised by the fact that for about an hour I passed through quite an emotional catharsis about his death. I saw that I had never really made a connection of mutual understanding with him during his lifetime. He had never understood why I went to the monastery, and I had never really understood him. Perhaps I remember feeling, if only we had had one last conversation and really straightened out our relationship. Avatar Adidar Samraj. The more dependent you are on someone who is dead or dying, the more you enter into the ritual sorrow. But it is really yourself that you are dealing with. Your primary activity in relation to the death of another is self-meditation, a narcissistic ritual in which you feel confounded, frustrated, reactive, and basically disconnected. The feeling of disconnection is an essential part of your reaction. You are rehearsing a rather infantile condition, a gesture with which you have been involved since birth, and the acknowledgement of your independent existence. To hear of somebody else's death becomes an opportunity to rehearse the fearful unhappiness you feel in relation to your own death. When you hear of another's dying, you indulge in that pattern of unhappiness, either slightly, but nevertheless, really, or else very dramatically. Yet it is really your own wound, your own disease that you are ritualizing. Very little that you do in relation to someone who has died has anything to do with him or her. Most of what you do has to do with yourself. It is a ritualized expression of your own difficulty. You are going to die. There is no doubt about that. And everybody you know is going to die. Thus, it is your business while alive to confront and understand the great fact of death and be free of egoic ritualization relative to it. Part of the essential matter associated with spiritual life is to deal with that very disease, that very ritual response to death, so that you are free to die and to change altogether, and also free to have others do the same thing in your lifetime. You really have no right to defend yourself against death, either your own or someone else's. Every moment of your living should take the inevitability of death totally into account. If you are living consciously, then when you are obliged to encounter the death of someone else, you are equipped to be as free as possible of the ego-based ritualization. You do not defend yourself against the mere fact of the death, but rather you to participate in the entire affair, even continue to engage in that relationship with the least possible impediment created by your own reaction, your own unhappiness relative to death, your own presumption of separation. To the degree you feel you are just an independent, mortal being, you will be ritualized in your response to everyone else's death. There really is only one death, anybody's death. The same ritual is always enacted, and what are you dramatizing? Your own decomposition, your own derangement. Death is the ultimate fact of life, not merely the end of it. This world is just a bardo, a place of transition. There is whatever there was before, there is whatever there is after, and there is whatever there is ultimately. And whatever there is ultimately is the ultimate fact before and during and after whatever is going on now or then, past, present, or future. To realize that ultimate reality while alive, you must be free of your ego-based ritualization of existence and be always encountering the reality of living, not divorced from that reality through ritual. All this social face, these bodily attitudes, the tendencies toward emotional reaction, dependence and independence, all the character games you play all day long, all the ways you deal with primary events in life, all are a ritual, a defense, an expression of narcissus, the self-contracted personality that is fundamentally devoted to defending itself against the realities of the great process that is life in truth, and in the course of that defense, divorcing itself further from the prior condition in which these changes are occurring. In your clinging to your relations, you are rather sorrowful and dependent. You feel that certain relations are necessary for your sense of happiness. Particularly in certain moments you feel this, and you feel this in some ultimate sense about everyone on whom you depend and whom you want to keep around you all your life. Actually, however, you are completely free of dependency. Happiness, truly realized, is not dependent on anything. It may seem to be dependent on something now, but it could just as well seem to be dependent on something else in the next moment. You seem to be dependent on someone now, but you could just as well transfer your dependence to someone else. You can make an entire series of connections and engage in the ritual feeling of dependence, feeling happy, more or less, in those relations. But actually, you are always playing on the reservoir of unconditional and unlimited happiness that is found in the divine self-position. In the present moment, you may feel so dependent on someone that you would be very sorrowful if he or she left you. But in fact, you can transfer the same interest to someone or something else and feel just as happy, such that the previous one could leave you. This ordinary fact tells you that you are not really dependent on anyone or anything, but you are engaging in a ritual of dependence and locating your happiness in various relations. In my avataric divine incarnation here, I reveal to you that true happiness is divine. True happiness is not dependent on the objects and relations of life. True happiness is inherent in the divine self position, which, it must be realized, is the real condition of your life. Your noticing of this is the beginning of renunciation, the beginning of the expression of true understanding, which does not dissociate you from relations, but which you simply associates you with a greater principle, the great principle. Therefore, rather than making your conventional happiness depend on your relations, turn to me instead, and thereby magnify true happiness in your relations. In your moment-to-moment turning to me, you magnify that which is inherent where you, in reality, stand, rather than depend on relations. Adida, for me, is the agent of God, the divine, which is my true condition, and which we all are truly already happy. So when he says turn to me, he literally means turn to the divine condition of already happiness, which for me is accessed by his bodily human form, which is the same for many of his devotees. If you depend on relations for conventional happiness, that feeling will always be corrupted and threatened, and will always be associated with the mechanism of dependence. Likewise, you will always be moved to become independent, because you do not like the feeling that happiness is dependent on someone else, some condition, some object, some circumstance. You do not really settle into even these dependencies. You rebel against them and become dissociative toward the very relations on which you depend. You corrupt your happiness even in circumstances in which you do have the option to be happy. Therefore, turn to me and discover the fullness of the true happiness that is inherent in the divine self-position. Discovering inherent happiness, you do not thereby dissociate from relations. Rather, you have the capability for the relationship. If you are already established in that which is happiness, in other words, then you are capable of relationship. The summary of the Hebrew law, as it appears in the New Testament, in a statement attributed to Jesus of Nazareth, is love God absolutely, and then love your neighbour fully. However, you do not tend to live according to this law. You live its opposite. You make your happiness depend on relations. Therefore, you are always suffering in the context of relationship. Suffering dependence, manufacturing independence, corrupting your relationships, going from object to object, going from relationship to relationship, struggling all your life in a circumstance in which you richly make happiness depend on relationships, and struggling with that very fact, resisting that very ritual. You live the law backwards. Instead of living from the point of view of the divine happiness that is realized in devotional self-surrender to the divine reality, you live in submission to others, objects, and relations. In moments, you find a certain kind of happiness in those relations and circumstances, but it is always being corrupted and threatened such that you eventually forget where the happiness is. You forget where it comes from. You forget its source. You forget its origin. You forget its divine nature, its unconditional divine nature. You must find unconditional happiness in real God, not God apart, or the parent God, or the childish God. You must directly find the source that is unconditional happiness, freedom, love, bliss, free consciousness, the fullness of divine being. Having fulfilled the first and fundamental aspect of the traditional law to love God, then enter into the sphere of relationships. Thus, you should enter into relationships not dramatizing the psychology of dependence, wherein you lose happiness or feel it to be threatened or allow it to be disturbed by the mechanisms of relationship, but magnifying that true happiness which you know in heart communion with me. Then your relations are no longer the expressions of dependence on objects for happiness. Therefore, instead of being established in the ego, which is already separate from true happiness and finds it only simulated through the mechanics of relationship, you must turn to me and thereby be established prior to the ego base in the true happiness which I am. Then you may enter into relations as the play or the expression or the modification of that great divine reality. Da. In doing so, you will be free in relationship, not free of relations in the sense that you are detached and do not care about them, but already really happy, magnifying real happiness by loving others, and thereby always allowing change and inevitable separations to occur in the framework of this born existence. If you rightly fulfill the traditional law, then ultimately your immersion in my great well of happiness will outshine the noticing of relations and objects and the separate I, or functional ego. Everything arising is nothing but a play on the divine reality, a modification of that. Therefore, if, by means of my avataric divine spiritual grace, you realize that most perfectly, then the play of modification will most ultimately, in divine translation, disappear and dissolve in the bright love bliss fullness of divine being. This is my divine avataric divine word and my avataric divine self-revelation to you. The instruction I have herein given must apply to every aspect of your living. Therefore, it must apply to all your troubled wondering about death and separations and of all kinds. Da. Da. Da.